Okay. Well, can I start by saying thank you very much for having me, but I'm sorry I'm not physically present. And you probably know by now that it's because I broke my leg and I'm not allowed to get around. So there we are. The last few weeks have been quite interesting in point of our refugee policy because, as everyone is aware, we've just reintroduced the Pacific solution. If the overarching question is, are we getting it right? I think the answer is affirmatively, emphatically no. To return to the Pacific solution strikes me as being a seriously retrograde step. There's a number of reasons for that. The first item, of course, is how small our refugee intake is. Now, our offshore resettlement program presently provides for 13,750 people to come in. For reasons of the government's own choosing, any boat arrivals are counted against that number, so that one way or another, our total refugee intake is very limited and by most standards very small. It's quite interesting to consider that under the Pacific Solution Mark II, we will intercept people who are seeking to get to Australia by boat, and we will divert them to Nauru or Manus Island. Now, Nauru is an interesting choice. No doubt it's been chosen because the Leader of the Opposition is very enthusiastic about it. And it's an interesting choice because it is a Pacific Island nation with a population of 10,000 people. Nauru, which now has an honest government, but under Pacific Solution Mark I had a corrupt government, Nauru this time has said, first of all, they will cap the number of refugees they take to 1,500, and second, they've insisted that the people should stay there for as short a time as possible. 1,500 is interesting because it represents an increase in their population of 15%. Number of boat people who come to Australia each year at the moment, and at the moment it's an all-time high since the post-Vietnam War days, represents about a quarter of 1% of our population. Now, because the numbers are so small, and because the burden on Australian society is so tiny, then it seems to me an absurd idea to think that we ought to impose on Pacific Island neighbours to disembarrass us of the small number of boat people who actually get here. Politicians from both major parties are getting their policy directions from news polls and focus groups in key marginal electorates where the elections are decided. And it's a great tragedy, I think a national tragedy for which we should forever be ashamed. Xenophobia lies just below the surface in most Australians, and it's easily scratched. And politicians who are cynical enough are willing to scratch it to the surface and then exploit it for their own political end. They've tagged them as queue jumpers. For a brief, shameful moment, they tagged them as people who would throw their children overboard. All of those bits of rhetoric, of course, are dishonest because we know that it's not a criminal offence to come to Australia and seek asylum. We know that no refugees threw their children overboard. We know that Peter Reith lied about it and maintained the lie, even in the face of an unravelling story. But the politicians know, on both sides of the House, that there are still votes to be scraped from the bottom of the barrel if they adopt this sort of xenophobic approach. But I think it's a great national tragedy that we are prepared to let our national character be traduced by appealing to the lowest common denominator, who've all been misled by a series of lies propagated by the Howard government, maintained by the Abbott opposition, and tacitly approved by the government. In those circumstances, yes, there's a political price to pay for being nice to refugees. There's a political advantage to be got by being unkind to them, and that seems to trump our more fundamental values. The current debate on treatment of asylum seekers and the current policy settings on boat people represent a complete failure of national leadership. I think Australia has done a reasonable job in a limited way in adhering to the central obligation of the Refugees Convention. I mean, we have, after all, imported into our domestic law the Convention test for refugee status. I think we take the requirement to assess refugee status quite seriously. The central obligation in the Convention is not to refool anyone, and I think that broadly speaking, we have honoured that obligation. However, we have not honoured our parallel obligations under the ICCPR, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention Against Torture, because we know from several rulings of the Human Rights Committee that indefinite mandatory detention of asylum seekers is a breach of the ICCPR. We know that holding children in immigration detention is a breach of several provisions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We seem to disregard our obligation under those conventions with apparent unconcern. The Pacific solution, of course, raises more complex questions because I don't think it is consistent with the spirit of the Refugees Convention to try and palm off our convention obligations onto other countries. Now, I do think that, the central point, the spirit of the Refugees Convention after the Second World War was to make sure that in future the burden of refugee movements would be spread uniformly rather than be borne by countries that were immediately adjacent to trouble spots. Australia's attitude at the moment seems to be, how dare these people get here? Why don't they stay in Pakistan or Iran or somewhere else, anywhere but here? And if they do get here, well, then we'll shove them off to somewhere else. The fact that we call it offshore processing, of course, is more of a lie than anything else, because what we're doing is saying you can go somewhere else and there your claim for refugee status will be assessed, but you are not allowed to apply for an Australian protection visa when you're offshore. So we are in effect pushing them away and closing the door behind them. Whether that works remains to be seen. My own assessment is that it will not work. First, because the numbers that can be warehoused by Papua New Guinea and Nauru are so small. Second, because the people who are in Indonesia considering getting on a boat are unlikely to be dissuaded from doing that merely because they think that their journey will be interrupted by a year or two in Nauru or Papua New Guinea. Frankly, I think the whole thing is going to be a spectacular waste of money. At the moment, our detention system is costing about $1 billion a year. That's quite a lot of money. The Pacific solution, Mark II, I've worked out, is likely to cost, this is on 2005 costings, it's likely to cost between $9 billion and $43 billion over the next 3 years. Now, that's a whole lot of money. That is really a lot of money for warehousing people who will probably end up here anyway. I've actually, through Twitter, I've established a competition for the best ways we could spend $15 billion other than throwing it at the Pacific solution. And I've offered a prize for the best suggestions and an even better prize for the best suggestion from a Liberal voter, because I think Liberal voters have often got quite good ideas about how to spend government money. I would quite like to see Australia save itself $15 billion and spend it sensibly on things that will help the community rather than simply damaging people and pursuing a version of this country which I think is false to our real values. Incidentally, $15 billion, no one has any intuitive sense of what $15 billion is, but it works out to be $1 a second for 475 years. So it's a lot of money. The fact that we've been involved in the military intervention in Afghanistan, I think, changes the ethical dynamics somewhat, just as it did after the end of the Vietnam War. I think that certainly our humanitarian intake needs to be increased substantially. 20,000, I think, is a minimal increase. Welcome, but I think it could have been increased to 30 or 40,000 without much difficulty, given that our annual migration intake is in the order of 200,000, give or take. The demographic difficulties of a humanitarian intake of 30 or 40,000 a year is not very great. I think that because we are prosperous, it rather increases the moral obligation to do more than we're presently doing. And I think we also need to bear in mind that one of the things that is notable in Australia's brief history since white settlement is the extent to which we have benefited from migration from overseas. I can still remember growing up in Melbourne in the 1950s when there was a significant number of refugees and displaced persons coming from southern Europe, especially Greece and Italy, and from Eastern Europe, notably Polish Jews. I remember people of my parents' generation talking darkly about the difficulties of these refos and DPs coming and saying how they were too religious, they had too many children, their women dressed from head to foot all in black, and they didn't learn English, and they had too many children, and all of that, and they ate weird food. Of course, that was very important. I remember still when it was truly exotic to have cappuccino. I remember when it was really exotic to have spaghetti that did not come out of a tin. Now, we sort of managed to get over that eventually, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find many people in Australia who would now say, gee, I wish those Italian and Greek migrants hadn't come to Australia in the 1950s. What a better place we'd be if they hadn't come here. Why is that? Because the fact is, we have taken the benefit of their cultural contribution. They have contributed in all sorts of ways to Australian society, and no one now, no sensible person now would say there was any difficulty. The same can be said of the post-war migration from Indochina. The fact is, the Australian culture, I think, has been significantly improved by that very significant migration of boat people after the Vietnam War, in numbers much greater than we're getting now. Fraser's government brought in between 20 and 25,000 boat people a year, processed in Indonesia, offered immediate resettlement on being established as refugees, and brought in without a political fuss. Now, we were a smaller country then. We took far more then than is ever likely to happen right now, and there was virtually no political or social concern about it. We can do it. We've done it before. We should be doing it again, and we should recognise the advantages that we get by migrants and refugees coming here. Our offshore resettlement program is good, and we should be proud of that. Not every country has an offshore resettlement program. We do. I think that's fantastic. The offshore resettlement program and boat people should not be linked together. There should not be a trade-off of one against the other. That's a self-inflicted problem which we should get rid of straight away. The way we deal with refugees once they are accepted as refugees and are brought into the community, I think, is also pretty good. By and large, I think we deal with them well. The hostility we show them before they come, the hostility we show them when they arrive, the way we treat them between arrival and release on a protection visa are all, I think, discreditable. By and large, I think we're doing a really bad job, notwithstanding the good bits. And it's a really bad job because the good bits are disfigured profoundly by the fact that some politicians, actually most of them it seems, are willing to say, this is a country that's prepared to lock up innocent people indefinitely. This is a country that's prepared to jail children indefinitely because they've come asking for our help. That's not the Australia I grew up in. I do not believe it represents Australian values, and I think it's a scandal that our politicians are willing to act as if that's something that the country agrees on. The question is there a way out of the rut? And I think there is, but it's going to take political courage and political leadership. The problem is that there's a degree of support in the community at large for our current treatment of refugees because a lot of people in the community are still misled on the facts. A lot of people in the community still believe that asylum seekers are illegal. A lot of people in the community still are deceived into thinking that there's a queue somewhere that these people ought to be standing in. Now, so long as people believe those falsehoods, then it's not surprising that they support government measures designed to dissuade those people from acting that way, and in particular if it's dressed up as saving those people's lives. Although there's an interesting anomaly in that. We seem to be troubled terribly by the idea that people might lose their lives crossing the ocean to get to here. We're much less troubled by the fact that if they don't, they may just be killed by the Taliban. Now, I suspect that a lot of boat people think, well, I'm just as dead by drowning as I am by being killed by the Taliban. I'll take my chances. And I suspect that a lot of Australians, maybe most Australians, if stuck in Indonesia without any realistic prospect of resettlement anywhere, faced only by the opportunity of either going back and facing the Taliban or getting on a boat and taking a risk, most Australians would take a risk. And what I would like to do is to be able to get Julia Gillard and Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison and Chris Bowen to stand up and say honestly, if they were Hazaras in Indonesia facing a 20 or 30 or 40 year delay before they could get to a place of safety, what would they do? I bet they'd get on a boat. I bet they'd take a chance. And I think most people would. So why on earth should the Australian public criticise people who are doing exactly what they would do if the shoe was on the other foot? So what's the way out of the rut? I think the way out of the rut is a bit of political leadership in which someone who can get the ear of the tabloid press, someone to stand up and say, these people are running for their lives. They're doing nothing wrong. They're doing what you would do. We've got the space and we've got the wealth to make them safe. Let's do that. That would be a way out of it, but it takes political leadership, of which in Australia there is none. I do. I think both parties are responsible for it. There is almost nothing that separates their approach to it, and I think both parties deserve equal criticism for where we've got to. I think Julia Gillard had an opportunity about 12 or 18 months ago. She could have said, we are not going to bow to Tony Abbott's rhetoric. We're going to treat asylum seekers decently, and here are the reasons why. And there are plenty of good reasons for treating asylum seekers much better than we are presently treating them. At very worst for her, she would have lost the next election in a blaze of decency. But instead, what she did was to hang on to the possibility of regaining some ground by, in effect, following Abbott's lead and allowing the opposition to set the agenda. I do want to end with one observation, and that is that Pacific Solution Mark II is a political fact. I think it's very important that we make sure that it operates in a way that's fair. The processing that took place on Manus Island and Nauru during Pacific Solution Mark I was catastrophically unfair. Of course, it was all being done in a way that insulated it from any sort of judicial oversight. And when decision makers who are driven by political considerations do not have the courts overseeing their work, the result is likely to be unfair. A simple example of the unfairness, which should give you an idea, is that Hazaras from Afghanistan, who were taken to Nauru and were processed there, had Pashtun interpreters. Now that's like having a Nazi interpreter for a Jewish refugee in 1938. You know, the unfairness of it is so obvious that you really don't have to elaborate on it. Towards the end, when Marion Lay was able to go in and reopen some of the files, she found catastrophic mistakes being made. And we know that a lot of Hazaras were forcibly repatriated to Afghanistan merely because the Taliban had been removed from power. Everyone can see now what an appalling mistake that was. So at least this time, we need to make sure, by whatever means, that the processing that is being done on Manus Island and on Nauru is fair processing. And as I understand it, Mr Morrison will be attending this conference. I hope that Mr Bowen will be either attending or paying attention to it. I hope that the two of them will take steps to make sure that if we must farm out processing to Nauru and Papua New Guinea, we make sure that that processing is fair, because otherwise we will be in breach of our non-refoulement obligations. We will be causing other countries to send real refugees back to a place of persecution, and that'd be catastrophic. Thanks very much.